I was born at Blunderstone in Suffolk in the east of England, and was given my poor father's name, David Copperfield. Sadly, he never saw me. He was much older than my mother when they got married, and died 6 months before I was born. My father's death made my beautiful young mother very unhappy, and she knew she would find life extremely difficult with a new baby and no husband. The richest and most important person in our family was my father's aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood. She had in fact been married once to a handsome young husband, but because he demanded money from her and sometimes beat her, she decided they should separate. He went abroad and soon news came of his death. Miss Trotwood bought a small house by the sea and lived there alone with only one servant. She had not spoken to my father since his marriage because she considered he had made a mistake in marrying a very young girl. But just before I was born, when she heard that my mother was expecting a baby, she came to visit Blunderstone. It was a cold, windy Friday afternoon in March. My mother was sitting by the fire, feeling very lonely and unhappy. Suddenly, a stern, strange-looking face appeared at the window. "Open the door," ordered the stern-faced lady. My mother was shocked but obeyed at once. "You must be David Copperfield's wife. I am Betsy Trotwood. You have heard of me?" "Yes," whispered my mother, trembling. "How young you are! Just a baby!" cried Miss Betsy. My mother started sobbing again. "I know I look like a child. I know I was young to be a wife, and I am young to be a mother, but perhaps I'll die before I become a mother." Come, have some tea. Then you'll feel better. What do you call your girl?" "My girl? I don't know yet that it will be a girl," replied my mother miserably. "No, I don't mean the baby. I mean your servant." "Her name is Peggotty. Her first name is Clara, the same as mine, so I call her by her family name." "What a terrible name! However, never mind. Peggotty," she called, going to the door. "Bring Mrs. Copperfield some tea at once." She sat down again and continued speaking. "You were talking about the baby. I'm sure it will be a girl. Now, as soon as she is born..." "He, perhaps," said my mother bravely. "Don't be stupid. Of course it will be a she. I'm going to send her to school and educate her well. I want to prevent her from making the mistakes I have made in my life." Miss Betsy looked quite angry as she said this. My mother said nothing as she was not feeling at all well. "But tell me, were you and your husband happy?" asked Miss Betsy. This made my poor mother feel worse than ever. "I know I was not very sensible about money or cooking or things like that. But we loved each other, and he was helping me to learn. And then he died. Oh!" And she fell back on her chair, completely unconscious. Peggotty realized how serious the situation was and took my mother upstairs to bed. The doctor arrived soon afterwards and stayed all evening to take care of his patient. At about midnight, he came downstairs to the sitting room where Miss Betsy was waiting impatiently. "Well, doctor, what's the news? How's she?" "The young mother is quite comfortable, madam," replied the doctor politely. "But she, the baby, how's she?" cried Miss Betsy. The doctor looked strangely at Miss Betsy. "It's a boy, madame," he replied. Miss Betsy said nothing, but walked straight out of the house and never came back. That was how I was born. My early childhood was extremely happy, as my beautiful mother and kind Peggotty took care of me. But when I was about 8, a shadow passed over my happiness. My mother often went out walking in her best clothes with a gentleman called Mr. Murdstone. He had black hair, a big black mustache, and an unpleasant smile, and seemed to be very fond of my mother. But I knew that Peggotty didn't like him. A few months later, Peggotty told me that my mother was going to have a short holiday with some friends. Meanwhile, Peggotty and I would go to stay with her brother Daniel in Yarmouth for 2 weeks. I was very excited when we climbed into the cart, although it was sad saying goodbye to my mother. Mr. Murdstone was at her shoulder waving goodbye as the driver called to his horse, and we drove out of the village. When we got down from the cart in Yarmouth after our journey, Peggotty said, "That's the house, Master David." I looked all around, but could only see an old ship on the sand. "Is that your brother's house?" I asked in delight, and when we reached it, I saw it had doors and windows and chimney, just like a real house. I could not imagine a nicer place to live. Everything was clean and tidy, and smelt of fish. Now I was introduced to the Peggotty family. There was Daniel Peggotty, a kind old sailor. Although he was not married, he had adopted 2 orphans who lived with him and called him uncle. Ham Peggotty was a large young man with a gentle smile, and Emily was a beautiful blue-eyed little girl. They all welcomed Peggotty and me warmly. I spent a wonderfully happy 2 weeks there, playing all day on the beach with Emily and sleeping in my own little bed on the ship. I'm sure I was in love with little Emily in my childish way, and I cried bitterly when we had to say goodbye at the end of the holiday. But on the way home to Blunderstone, Peggotty looked at me very worriedly. "Master David, my dear," she said suddenly in a trembling voice, "I must tell you. You'll have to know now. While we have been away, your dear mother has married Mr. Murdstone. He is your stepfather now." I was deeply shocked. I could not understand how my mother could have married that man. And when we arrived home, I could not help showing my mother how very miserable I was. I went straight to my room and lay sobbing on my bed, which made my poor mother very unhappy too. As she sat beside me, holding my hand, Mr. Murdstone suddenly came in. "What's this, Clara, my love?" he asked sternly. "Remember, you must be firm with the boy. I have told you before, you are too weak with him." "Oh yes, Edward, I'm afraid you are right," my mother replied quickly. "I'm very sorry. I'll try to be firmer with him." And when she left the room, Mr. Murdstone whispered angrily to me, "David, do you know what I'll do if you don't obey me? I'll beat you like a dog." I was still very young, and I was very frightened of him. If he had said one kind word to me, perhaps I would have liked and trusted him, and my life would have been different. Instead, I hated him for the influence he had over my dear mother, who wanted to be kind to me but also wanted to please her new husband. That evening, Mr. Murdstone's sister arrived to help my mother in the house. A tall, dark lady with a stern, frowning face. She looked and sounded very much like her brother. I thought she was planning to stay with us for a long time, and I was right. In fact, she intended to stay forever. She started work the next morning. "Now, Clara," she said firmly to my mother at breakfast, "I am here to help you. You are much too pretty and thoughtless to worry about the servants, the food, and so on. So, just hand me your keys to all the cupboards and I'll take care of everything for you." My poor mother just blushed, looked a little ashamed, and obeyed. From then on, Miss Murdstone took complete control of the house, keeping the keys hanging from her waist as she hurried through the house, checking that everything was being done just as she wished. To be continued in Chapter 2.